Good day, this is Paul Benjamin Lowry. Today I want to give a presentation related to a topic that's really important to me that I've worked on for several years related to good conceptual reviews that can make academics more successful when engaging in the sciences of the artificial. Now, this is a call out to Herbert Simon. And when I talk about the sciences of the artificial, I'm speaking quite broadly, basically about interdisciplinary efforts around people, technology, organizations, processes, design artifacts, culture, and the mix thereof. I find that reviews in these kinds of fields are particularly challenging, especially with my classical training, which was in information systems, business management, and communication. So moving on, I want to give a shout out to a primary source of inspiration for this presentation. Dorothy Liner gave an inspiring keynote speech in 2018 at the JAIS Theory Building Workshop. And she has a companion piece she wrote up in the Journal of the Association for Information Systems. Also have received inspiration from work with my co-authors of Nick Hassan and Lars Mathieson. And at the end of the presentation, I give full attribution to my other sources. So again, giving credit to Dorothy Liner especially, she is the Ferguson Professor of Information Systems at Baylor University. And as of 2020, she is the editor-in-chief of the journal for the Association for Information Systems, which is the flagship journal in the information systems discipline. Dorothy in particular is a great writer and scholar and is known for her excellent conceptual reviews that are well cited. So she's an excellent source to draw inspiration from. As for myself, I don't necessarily consider myself on the level of writing as Dorothy, but certainly as passionate about writing and literature and really getting into various socio-technical aspects of the sciences of the artificial. So I offer some additional thoughts and suggestions in this area. In particular, I bring to bear some design artifacts and theory ideas related to these. So to kick off this presentation, I want to present to you a visual taxonomy of review types. And I'm a big believer in taxonomies and topologies, not only in presenting and writing, but in theory building and conceptualizing. In this case, I'll work through a taxonomy or topology around the different types of reviews. This is important to conceptually get your mind around what exactly am I going to try to contribute to the discourse or the conversation of the researchers in this area that I'm interested in. So filling out the taxonomy, I'll just work down vertically. I'll start with some simple columns, some things to think about when you consider doing a review project to make it less of a literature review, a little more narrative, conceptual, and contributory in terms of theory. So think about the overarching goal of the review that you want to do, and then match it. Think of the various review types that I'm going to work through. And then consider the search strategy that is involved with each review type as you put together the different elements of information for the review. And finally, also really you need to be mindful of the particular methods that are used to synthesize reviews. This is increasingly important, especially at top journals, to do this right. So when you find a type of review you want to do, you want to make sure you find good examples in your journals of similar review types. Not to follow as an arid script, but to get an appreciation and understanding of how those review types typically unfold. And of course, adding your own creativity and your own structure within those bounds. So let's work through the first type of reviews in terms of the overarching goal that we can categorize them by. So in this group of reviews, the overarching goal is to summarize prior knowledge. Here, there are three review types. A narrative review has a search strategy that it tends to be very selective, often top journals. So it's in top journal articles and in particular discourse. So it's not going to be a very exhaustive dissertation style literature review. And the methods to synthesize this review type tends to be more of a narrative summary. Now, this takes a lot of skill, whether or not people buy into the rigor and quality of this method. And it really falls down to good writing, good argumentation, and logic skills, which is true in general, something you want to apply with all reviews, but especially narrative reviews. Descriptive reviews are more representative, so the methods, so you'll search more broadly and you're more likely to use content and frequency analysis, which is also true of a scoping review, but here you're looking at a full search strategy within a tight scope, and it's often bounded by the quality of the articles. Quality is a very big consideration as you do reviews because not all findings are equal in claims and support and so forth. So it behooves you to read the articles to have an understanding of the quality of the argumentation therein. Now, in terms of the other category of reviews we'll next talk about is data aggregation or integration. These tend to be a little more data and information centric, especially meta-analysis, which is a very empirically oriented review approach with a series of various methods that can be used to do various kinds of moderation analysis, direct comparison of effects, meta-regression, meta-structural equation modeling, and so forth. So it's quite a rigorous approach. And so for this approach, interestingly, it tends to be a pretty open, broad search strategy because part of the issue here is the file drawer problem. You're trying to find everything around the phenomena of interest. But you do have to filter out results that are of dubious quality, poor reliability, and measurement. But other than that, this review type will often include working papers. Systematic review doesn't include working papers, but is also very full, but is more of a narrative synthesis. Umbrella, same kind of idea, but you're taking a broader scope than systematic. A third major category of review types is explanation building. Here, your more traditional theoretical review article or conceptual review article in pretty full search strategy. And here you might be using more content analysis or interpretive methods. Theory building, this one is really wide open, and theory, of course, depends on the epistemology that you choose. Often in sciences of artificial, you'll typically see a lot of post-positivism, interpretivism, and so forth. But here we're actually proposing original propositions and models that have underlying propositions with causal mechanisms, and you're creating new narrative, new explanations. And so this is probably the most original one, the most creative one, and very difficult to publish, but very high impact. And then there's a realist view where you take an iterative and purposeful approach and can use mixed methods. Finally, another category of review, I just put one type for now on its own, a critical review. And it's quite a selective or representative review type. And it's really about getting in critically using content analysis or critical discourse analysis or various approaches to really rigorously criticize, critique the concepts in the area or the research. This one's also very challenging to pull off effectively because, as you can imagine, people in your discourse may not like to be criticized. So this has to be very carefully, very artfully done. Now, moving from that, I want to show topology that was inspired by Dorothy's work, primarily based on hers and her JAIS paper. But I've added some visualization to this to try to help you see it better. Again, this is just another way to look at review articles. Don't be bounded by this. It's not exhaustive, but it's a nice illustration of how to think about the purpose of your reviews. So like a good topology, this one is based on a 2x2 matrix where the research objective of the review article is on the vertical axis, and that ranges from theorizing or new and improved explanations of why, these underlying causal explanations. The bottom of the axis, synthesize to make sense of existing explanations. Across the x-axis, we have the consideration of review focus, which could be describe, so contextual differences, paradoxes, logical flaws, interesting things going on, but in a descriptive manner. Identify, which is more about finding the trends, the patterns, the gaps. This is more of what you often think of with the PhD student first review, more of trends, gap spotting, and putting that together. So filling out the 2x2 topology, in the upper left quadrant, we have what we call phenomena theory, or the review informs the theory. So this is quite creative in terms of explanations of why. In the upper right quadrant, we have gap filling theory. Here, the review informs the gap. So typical gap spotting exercise, but filling in with new or improved explanations of why to address the gap that you find. In the lower left quadrant, we have emergent organizing frameworks. So here you're creating a framework style review that describes everything in newly organized form in terms of taxonomies and typologies. This type of review is often underappreciated in my estimation. This is really important for emergent discourses or newer areas where you're trying to get a handle on the differences between concepts that are similar, and so that you have a common nomenclature with which you can converse. Finally, we have a priori organizing frameworks. So here you're typically using known a priori organized forms to refine gaps. So this one tends to be a little less creative, but trends and gap spotting and trying to get a good handle on the literature. So this one in particular is a nice one for newer academics to start with. So returning to Dorothy's paper, you can further think about this topology, when you think about these in terms of their breadth or how narrow they are. So the left column, these reviews tend to be broader reviews. So these require more literature, more breadth of consideration. The review types on the right, the right column, are more narrow. So these tend to be a little more specialized in the discourse or the problem that you're getting into. Another consideration that she emphasizes is the degree of creativity involved in the review type. So moving up the first row, these kinds of reviews tend to be more creative. And the two review types in the bottom row tend to be less creative and more mechanistic. Now, this is an important consideration because it does take a little more training and time to do creative reviews highly effectively. Finally, another way to think about these reviews as well, as you would suspect, that the creative spectrum also moves from the left. So the least creative, the most systematic type of review, great one for the first literature review a student does, is an a priori organizing framework. Then moving left, as we describe more contextually and we're looking for logic flaws and paradoxes and more interesting things about the concepts, this becomes more creative. So these are three ways that you can further look at this topology. In Dorothy's paper, she does a nice job of laying out various review articles that she has published in her career or is in process of publishing, and she has put these on the topology that she's proposed. Now, I don't necessarily agree fully with all of her distinctions of where she puts her work on the topology, but that doesn't matter. The key thing is to think through these things and to look for example review papers that can inspire you around the type of review that you want to do. Again, not as a tight, arid script, but as a guide and to see how it's done well. And of course, you can see Dorothy has done several of these very well. And when you time a good review paper, when a discourse needs it, they can be exceptionally cited, such as her review in particular around knowledge management, which is a citation classic. So again, this is how Dorothy sees her work in terms of her topology. So if you want to find more of a straightforward, more systematic, less creative approach, you would look for the Schultz and Leibniz article. On the more creative side, more theoretical in terms of explanations of why, you would have the articles in the upper left quadrant. Again, we can debate whether, where things should fall where, but this is a very helpful way to think about your review project and to find really good examples in the top journals in the discourse you are trying to contribute to in the sciences of the artificial. So now this is the fun part of the presentation, to share our combined suggestions from Dorothy's paper, from my experiences having worked and lived globally and worked in academia in Hong Kong and in the United States. And much of what we have to share is through hard knocks, through our own hard learning experiences, which is a great way to go. We certainly need to submit our work, get it under peer review at our top journals, and that's where some of the best learning occurs. But you can help yourself succeed as you become more of a conceptual thinker when you do review articles in the sciences of the artificial, because we have this interesting dance between the design artifacts we're dealing with, technology, people issues, organization issues, culture, society, and so forth. And so it makes it quite challenging and exciting doing review articles at the right conceptual level and the right conversation in these areas. So one of the first key practices to really succeed in this area in our review work and even in our empirical work that needs a good conceptual justification, we really need to practice problematization. Now, for all of these suggestions, I have some follow-up articles that you can read at the end of the presentation to learn more about this. But the basic idea here is you really cannot find a compelling problem or a topic by mere gap spotting literature. Now, it's important. Gap spotting is necessary, but it is insufficient. So you need to know the literature, you need to know the gaps, but mere gaps alone do not point to a good problem. It can actually point to something that's not interesting at all. So we look for paradoxes and contradictory results and these kinds of things that are more interesting. So some suggestions here with problematization. The first thing to think about is rejecting the status quo. You need to choose a good problem in that it's not likely to give you an answer that people will consider to be common sense, especially within the scientific community you're trying to have a conversation in. If they feel, oh, this is known or you should know this, that's not a good problem. Now, this is a fun suggestion in the sciences of the artificial, and I feel very strongly about this, that we need to free ourselves from technology. Although we are all dealing with some aspect of technology, whether computer science or sociology, information systems or management, we need to be careful that we don't conflate technology with good conceptual issues and with concepts, because good concepts, good problems, archetypal problems are not dependent on specific technologies, trends, or fads. So we know then by our hard experience here that if you find yourself mixing conceptualization with specific kinds of technology, you're going to have a review problem or a concept problem. So you want to think about, well, what does the technology represent? I'm not studying Zoom, I'm studying what Zoom affords or allows in terms of collaboration. So Zoom may be an operationalization of how I study it, but what am I really trying to get at? Group memory or collaboration or group outcome satisfaction? These are the things we want to look at. So for example, using COVID-19, perhaps we want to look at supply chain resilience and issues during black swan events, such as COVID-19. So we really strip ourselves of this technology and keep the technology to our context to sell our work and to operationalization as far as where we decide to measure and implement our concepts. So enter the right conversation. This is something Nick and Lars and I have written about passionately, about really figuring out the discourse that you're in, the questions that matter to your discourse and the problems, because if you're entering the wrong conversation, you're going to have a much harder time with the peer review process and the conversation in general. The final point in problematization that I strongly recommend is know your positioning. There are all kinds of different review, conceptual, and theory papers. You really need to know which kind and what approach you want to use. Regardless of your positioning, however, it's really important, even if you do the most systematic, the most mundane literature review, to try to make it narrative and to tell a story, to captivate the audience. There should be some degree of surprise or something that you convey to your audience that they didn't expect to learn or to know. Okay, aside from problematization, another thing that we really need to practice that's highly congruent with problematization is challenging and questioning assumptions. So this is what great scientists have always done, from Newton, Copernicus, Einstein, is to challenge prevailing assumptions. So likewise, we need to not assume that everything that's published, even in our top journals, is correct or the final word. So we need to really consider claims that are made, look at the logic, look at the argumentation, look at the evidence, and really challenge these and challenge the boundary conditions, the assumptions, the conditions under which the theory is supposed to operate. So how do you do this? There's four things I like to use, and there's many others. But one is looking for paradoxes, contradictions. And you can find this in paradoxical recommendations, paradoxical logic. The other thing is looking for myths. So prevailing practices, things that people believe to be true, but are really just tradition or mythological. The other really nice thing that I learned early on to do is to take a concept and to consider whether or not there is an opposite of it, and if it's truly an opposite. And there's lots of examples of this. It's quite easy to do. So early on in my career, I learned about the trust concept. And people would naturally think that distrust is just the opposite of trust. And so if you measure it, it's basically on the same scale. They're different spectrums of the same scale, right? Well, it turns out that's not true at all. And so I found research opportunities, and so have many other people, showing that conceptually trust and distrust are not opposites. They have some similarities, but they have some different components. And interestingly, in more recent times, in cognitive science, with fMRI studies, they have actually validated that indeed trust and distrust can activate in the brain at the same time. And the reason that could occur is there's different regions of the brain responsible for both. And so this also relates to some work I've done where high levels of trust, high levels of distrust can occur, and then that creates a concept we call ambivalence in subsequent results. So looking at is something really an opposite or not is a great assumption to challenge. Bad practice. So in sciences of the artificial, the nice thing for us is usually there's some pragmatic discipline we're tied to or trying to inform, whether it's education or business or technology or whatever. And what's great about that is practice is full of myth. Practice is full of bad procedures, policies, so on and so forth. And so this can be a really great way to motivate a problem and help you question assumptions that you can address through your review. Okay, so not to sound like your parent, but taking the time to do it right really matters in science. The details matter. The details matter. Good research takes time. So one of the things I learned to do, and I strongly advocate to all my students and colleagues, is to write every day. Maybe take one day off a week, but you need to be having a continual writing conversation with your most important work. Now, people have varying abilities and amount of time they can do this, but if you do this, if you're overburdened with teaching, writing 15 minutes a day in your best time will make a difference. So there's actually cognitive science around this because writing is this creative, innovative process by which we do science and theorize and conceptualize and make sense of things. If you're not writing as a habit, you're really holding yourself back to, doing good work. And in fact, research has shown that if you do binge writing, so you don't write for a few days and then you try to write all day to make up for it, that's a very bad approach. It's not nearly as effective of writing less, but almost every day. Try to focus on good problems in good contexts. When you zero in, when you problematize correctly, such that you find paradoxes or interesting things, then you can do not just one review, maybe you can do a couple, and then you can have a series of empirical works that will sustain you for several years. Now, this is worth taking the time to do right because then you're not jumping around the literature every few months. So when you hop around problems and hop around contexts, it makes it more difficult because you're restarting this conversation. And so likewise, you want to read and understand the best articles and the best journals. And in general, to sample from them and definitely in your discourse that you're trying to work in so that you know what the current tensions and conversations are so that you can enter that conversation. Okay, so to emphasize the last point, haste makes waste. We've heard that from all of our parents, and this was originally attributed to Benjamin Franklin, and it's definitely true. Likewise, if you've ever built a house or worked in construction, you'll know the carpenter's credo, which is measure twice, cut once. Again, it's worth taking the time to do it right. So in my professional career, I spent considerable time in management consulting and software engineering around very large custom software projects and large system implementations that were very expensive and complex. And my observation from that as I've applied and worked in the sciences of the artificial is that we need to practice science just like we would lead an advanced software engineering project. And that is to be engaged and to be iterative. So what this means, first of all, a call out to the great scholar Andy Van de Ven from University of Illinois, who's inspired me on this idea of engaged scholarship being foundational. So without engagement, you're having a still conversation with a literature that's already dated. Now, what it means in terms of sciences of the artificial is that even when we're doing conceptual reviews and we're deep in the literature, go talk to practice. So if you're trying to inform educators or business leaders or whomever, talk to them just like you would in a software engineering project. You need to talk to the end user because we've found through software engineering practice, if you're not engaging with management, if you're not engaging with the end user throughout the entire development process, the project will absolutely fail. Now, it's not quite the same, of course, with a conceptual review, but you will save yourself a lot of dumb mistakes when you run it by other people. So not just in practice, but other scholars or even friends. So here I strongly advocate from my scientific and professional experience that scholars in sciences of the artificial need to avoid the waterfall method to science. Now, what I mean here is in software engineering, the waterfall method would be essentially applying a very static sequential process of software engineering. So for example, we talk to the users to figure out their requirements. Then after that, we design the system. Then after that, we give the design to the developers. Then the developers develop the system. Then we give the system to the testers who test the system. And then we turn it over to the trainers who train the end users on the system. Although that's conceptually easy to understand in terms of software development, that will absolutely lead to complete failure because software development instead is engaged in iterative and cyclical. But it's the same thing with science. We cannot do our reviews, cannot do our science in a static waterfall manner. Third point of suggestion I have is like software development, we really need to be iterative and tenacious with the science that we practice in theorizing, in reviewing, such that we do our work, we share it, we reflect, we revise it, we go back, we theorize again, we work, we share, reflect, we revise. And this is a very time-intensive longitudinal process that involves engaged scholarship and continual writing. And through this process, you end up with such a better conceptual foundation for your work. So last but not least, given we're in the sciences of the artificial, I strongly advocate leveraging the tools of the mind, returning ourselves to that more innovative state when we were children to free up our creativity. So really be design thinkers, brainstorm, writing prolifically, reading prolifically, teaching and explaining to others, conducting thought experiments like the great Nobel laureates tend to do. Practice argumentation and logic skills. After all, the PhD, what does that stand for? Doctorate in philosophy. We were originally great philosophers who were adept at argumentation, logic, and working through these kinds of discourses, an art that we have unfortunately lost in many of the sciences of the artificial. Getting back to good argumentation and logic will absolutely free your mind to better work. Creating diagrams, tables, taxonomizing, trying to create diagrams and tables that are self-contained and self-explanatory that you can show to a parent or a friend and say, hey, tell me what you think this says. Metaphorizing, using analogies, using stories. After all, our memories stored in our brains are stored as schemas of little stories. So stories are very effective in metaphors and analogies of tapping into the schema in our cognition. Create artifacts, make things, nice slides, tables, prototypes, systems, designs, and run them by people. These tools of the mind help us with our conceptual thinking, writing, and ultimately our research. So another inspiring way to think about your work is to put yourself in the role of being a storyteller. Stories are so powerful, and what we are telling should be interesting. So why should anyone want to read this story? What is the tension? What is the surprise or mystery? What's the aha moment that they didn't see coming? So who is the white hat and the black hat, the good guy, the bad guy? So the tension in the literature, everyone likes having the bad guy and the good guy. What changes from reading your story? What kind of motivation is going to come to the reader? So thinking of science as artificial, your role as a scientist and as a storyteller really frees up the mind as you do these kinds of conceptual reviews, because that's what people want to read. They don't want to read an arcane, arid, painful list of references. So I said it before, I'll say it again, practice engaged scholarship. There's a lot of ways to do this, and I highly recommend Andy Vandeven's work in this area, who has really changed the discourse of science with business and management. So building on some of his ideas and mine in this regard, one of the things that you really want to be thinking about is the context. So, and we want to be middle range theorists like Merton advocated, and this kind of theory or conceptualization is highly contextualized. So, and these contexts of time, place, space, organization, culture, a lot of the contextualization that we seek to put around our concepts comes from practice. So that's another good reason to practice engaged scholarship, to find more interesting contexts which can help tell your story and motivate why people should care about the concept that you are trying to study. So here, one of the things about engaged scholarship is really just seeking others. Science is a very social discipline done properly. So we want to talk to people about our phenomena of interest that we're trying to put into a problem and context and trying to resolve in an interesting way. So anyone, really, friends, family, obviously practice, executives, PhD students, executive students. And finally, we forget to remember that so much of our engagement, so much of our discourse is with the reviewers and the editors. And so that's why picking the right journal and the highest quality of a journal that you can that's appropriate for your work is very important, and to be engaged and thoughtful and mindful of their feedback to learn from it. I would say in my career that honestly 90% of what I have learned as a scholar has come from good peer review and good editorial feedback. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy. Most of it was very painful and difficult and time consuming. But being open to that, receiving that feedback, being engaged with it, absolutely is the greatest education that you can receive in science. Part of engaged scholarship is that we need to be open to inspiration, and this is why time matters, because when we're in a rush, we make bad decisions and we're not open to inspiration. So part of what we need to do is not latch on or move too quickly to the first problem that we find that we like. So we need to be willing to kill off our ideas because our time is very limited. We need to decide how to best focus our time. So not latch on to things too early. So good conceptual projects morph over time. They change. You may have gone in with a certain purpose and it may go an entirely different direction. Even during peer review, this happens. In fact, I would say it frequently happens during peer review. So you need to be open to that and be ready for completely new directions. So, of course, seeking others and research literature, writing over time, and metaphorizing. One of the favorites Dorothy and I have here as well is just reading classic literature, because it helps reset your mind, but it also gives you a great example of good thinking. good argumentation, classic metaphors, stories that are timeless. These artifacts that come from classical literature can inspire and be sources of good logic and evidence for our work. Another part to me, especially of how I think of engaged scholarship, is giving back. And I learned this from my first mentor, my first advisor, J.F. Nunemaker Jr. at the University of Arizona, a great Regents scholar who's still very active in research. But this is one of the first things I remember him saying to us is that you always gain more by sharing than by holding back. And he didn't mean this in some religious sense. He was talking about science. And he was right. Collaboration, helping others, mentoring people, working with people who are outside of our comfort zones from different cultures, different backgrounds, teaching what we learn through seminars we teach, through classes, writing business school cases or practitioner articles, presenting the industry, doing consulting, and of course, giving back to the intellectual discourse is hugely important in terms of quality reviews, quality editing, and joining panels. So there's so many ways in science we need to give back because in such an ecosystem, we all move forward. It, and you absolutely gain more by doing so than by holding back because we always need help. We're never smart, good, and creative enough to do everything ourselves. So again, a shout out to my first mentor, advisor, J.F. Nunemaker Jr., taught me you always gain more by sharing than by holding back. Absolutely true. And it's returned to you. And it makes science a lot more enjoyable than when we, as opposed to taking an individualistic or competitive stance. Something I tell my students all the time that probably irritates them is that it's not enough to be really smart. Yes, we're all smart. We all had high standardized tests and so forth. But it's necessary, but it's insufficient. We need to think and act like scholars to get to that next level. Well, so how do you act like a scholar? My advice is to question everything. Use logic, facts, and evidence. Learn to be dispassionate. Get back to philosophy and the strong argumentation skills therein. Create, always. This is especially true in the sciences of the artificial because we deal with all kinds of artifacts that are human creations, and we love to do it. It's inspiring and it informs our science. And so we always need to be thinking in terms of being creators. And the primary way, again, of how we do this is by daily writing. This is the core creative act of any productive, effective scholar, is the frequent writing. So it's not enough to love writing and embrace it. We need to read passionately. So that is another daily practice of really reading what's going on in our discourses, looking at unrelated discourses at other top journals to see what's going on, amazing sources of inspiration, and of course my pet favorite and Dorothy's, reading classic literature. All right, to re-emphasize these points and to try to give more authority behind them, I lean on Einstein, who said, to question everything, to visualize creating. I think it's nice to think of creation itself. How did the universe come to be? It's awe-inspiring. Are there parallel multiple universes? What is our place in this creation? To return ourselves more like children who just love to create, and it was a playful act. When we get into that kind of creation, then we can really innovate with our concepts and the artifacts that we're working with. And finally, of course, a visualization of some great classic literature that can help us get outside of the very narrow discourses most of us are in and remember what it's like to be human and to remember what good thinking, good stories are that we can model. So next I'll share a mantra that I've developed over the years that basically to succeed in science, you must adopt a natural pace for yourself. Yet at the same time, you need to learn to push this pace over time to jump to higher levels of quality and production. It's really no different than marathon training, but with your mind. Likewise, you need to be patient and avoid comparing yourself to others. There will always be someone smarter. There will always be someone more accomplished. There will always be someone who is luckier. Perhaps they publish in a top journal and you can't believe that their paper got in that top journal. There will always be those cases. In science, it's not about you. You need to get over yourself and lose this impatience. Only then can you contribute meaningfully to the greater scientific discourse. Or more succinctly, in the words of Emerson, adopt the pace of nature. Her secret is patience. On that note, I want to end with some reflections and illustrations of the necessity of that patience and perseverance. We really start slowly as we learn the craft of science. Mastery takes time, patience, dedication, and tenacity. But I can guarantee you that a focus on mastery over time produces exponential results. So I'll use my career as illustration. I finished my PhD from the University of Arizona in 2002. Unfortunately, coming from industry, I thought it was a good idea to go through as quickly as possible. So I finished in 2 years and 7 months. This is a bad idea. This cut short my training and preparation. As a result, when I landed my first tenure track position upon graduation, which I was lucky to land, I had no journal articles, an H index of 0, and around 28 citations. By 2005, I started to have a little bit of success, the kind of success I would have had I stayed for a more appropriate length of time in PhD studies. So I finally received around 2 A-level journal articles, some other publications, and I started to have some degree of H-index and some citations. So H-index in this case meant that there were 7 publications somewhere out there that cited me 7 times or more. So started to appear on the radar, but certainly nothing impressive. Somewhere in this time period after 2005-ish, I realized the error of my ways in shorting the quality and length of my PhD training and realized that there are no shortcuts and I had to make up for that lack. I did so by doubling down on my commitment to write and to innovate and to submit to top journals, subject myself to highly critical feedback and engage scholarship. And I learned. I learned what I should have learned during my doctoral studies that I basically had flown through. So by 2010, I did achieve tenure with promotion to associate professor, had around 10 A-level articles. My H index was now 15, so there's 15 articles out there that cited me 15 times or more. And I had a relatively modest, decent number of citations starting to appear. I was starting to come on the radar at over 1,100 citations. At this point, I realized the way I was going to get myself up to the next level is I needed to go for the best opportunity possible to immerse myself fully in research and to training doctoral students, bringing in grants, doing the full works. Unfortunately, the US system of higher education was still pretty much in recession at this time. So for this opportunity, for this required training and experience that I knew I needed, I left, I gave up my tenure, I went overseas and moved to Hong Kong, where I took an untenured associate professor position at City University of Hong Kong to do it over and to do it right. And I knew that that commitment, that dedication of getting myself 7,000 miles away from home, family, friends, everything I knew, that this is what I needed to immerse myself to get to another level. My time at City University of Hong Kong and then subsequently at the University of Hong Kong, both eventually as tenured full professors, absolutely paid off. It was a fantastic period of discovery and engaged scholarship and putting my mind into the craft and into the discourses and just immersing and enjoying this experience while somehow raising a family, being married, and so forth. It worked. It was a wonderful period, and the results really started to show up around 2015, where I had quite a growth in A level articles. And then you can see my H index started to become more substantial and my citation count. So I was starting to have more influence. And what happens when you're in this kind of position in a career, then you have more choices. You have more opportunities. People now want to work with you. Back in 2002, 2005, no one wanted to work with me. I was a non-entity. But then by 2015, then you're flooded with opportunities. So eventually the giving comes back and the efforts come back and things start to exponentially increase in terms of mastery and the positive outcomes that come from mastery. And so here I am in mid 2020, and I have an endowed chaired professorship. I am running a PhD program. I spend most of my time immersed in research and writing and advising PhD students all of the year. I love it. I enjoy it. And the profound output increases in the last 5 years, I never could have imagined. It really is multiplying, where going from no journal articles, no H index, to actually in my mid-career, as I see myself as a chaired endowed professor, I'm just midway. And I've got another 30 years to really do something interesting now that I have figured things out. And so that's one of the reasons I want to share with others, is so that they can get to where I finally broke through sooner and perhaps may not have to make some of the sacrifices I made to be able to get to that next level. And so the message there is to take that time in PhD studies. Take the 5, 6 years to really do it right. Really immerse yourself. Take the time in your early untenured career to become expert in a discourse, to know it. The sooner you learn to do these things with engaged scholarship and thinking more conceptually, the sooner you will reap the rewards that absolutely come in academia by getting closer to mastery, which I will never achieve, but I am much closer to achieving than I was in 2002. So some closing comments on this. Let me share with you my basic formula for success on this journey toward mastery. For me, I see it as probably 20% of the right training and paying attention and getting the technical skills and learning the analysis and how to do things. And of course, much of this, the best learning is through peer review at top journals or top conferences. Another 20% I would ascribe to tenacity, not taking no for an answer. This is something I also learned from an advisor who frequently would say, do not take no for an answer. That's a great approach to science. We often give up too quickly on problems, conundrums, paradoxes, when that's where the very interesting breakthroughs are. Now, what about the other 60%? I would say, at least in my experience, that other 60%, it's the daily activities. It's the daily efforts at writing, reading, immersing yourself, teaching others, giving back, being discursive. So in closing, especially to younger scholars and those who are struggling with this, I can promise you the time and the effort and embracing the creativity, the innovation in sciences of the artificial is worth it. And we can go forth and change the world and make things better and enjoy the process of doing it. It is such a joyful experience to work in science, to work with other scientists, and to help create new scientists through PhD studies and affect practice by engaging with practitioners, affecting practice by teaching future practitioners. It's a virtuous cycle that is greatly rewarding and enjoyable. So I want to close thanking you for paying attention. I hope some things that I've shared with you today from my work, Dorothy's work, and my co-authors has been helpful to you. I'll close with my primary and secondary sources with gratitude to those involved. And if you have corrections on this presentation, suggestions, other resources that you would suggest, please email me anytime. I love engaging with scholars about these kinds of efforts. Thank you for your time.